but he's a pretty regular looking dude for his time period. And if you're looking, when President Truman was before he was President Truman, he was a captain in the U.S. artillery. And he was very good. He fought at the Battle of Meuse-Argonne and fought very bravely, and was able to sort of defy orders that were stupid and get away with it. So he was not typically insubordinate, but he saved his men by not following good orders, like bad orders. When he came back, he tried to become a suit salesman / clothes salesman. They call that haberdasher, and he didn't do well at that. He failed at that. But he then got into kind of local politics, and in Missouri, there's a political machine at this time. You guys remember machines were run by individuals, and the guy that was running it was a fellow named Boss Pendergast. And the Tom Pendergast machine ran Missouri Democratic politics. So that's how you got involved in politics in Missouri. So he came up through Missouri politics as a machine Democrat, right? Sort of a typical run-of-the-mill, and then he ultimately made it to the U.S. Senate after the 17th Amendment. So while he was in the Senate, we went to war. World War II was going on, and he presided over the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and a special committee whose job it was oversight of the war, and had done very well. So in 1944, Truman is tapped to be the VP, and with the understanding that he's kind of a hawkish dude, like kind of tough-minded, and he'll be a pretty solid person to have on the ticket in 44, which FDR winning was going to be kind of a foregone conclusion, right? But Truman was also known for his no-nonsense kind of attitude. This was a guy who was sort of not as energetic as Teddy Roosevelt, but very purpose-driven kind of thing. Like if he had something he wanted to accomplish, he got it done. Yeah, a straight shooter. That's a good way to put it. So Truman, I hope I'm like this, would tell you, call it like it was. And very famously, he had this sign on his desk that says, the buck stops here, which means he understood that the leader of the country had to take responsibility for what happened in America, right? So I'll show you a picture that he literally kept it on his desk of this sign, the buck stops here. And that means, I'm not going to, ignore the responsibility of being the ultimate person in charge, the commander in chief. And he really was sort of like, there it was on the Resolute desk in the White House. The buck stops here. And this note that I pulled here is true. He was not popular when he left office. We'll get to why he was unpopular in 52. But he is more recently rated very high. So Truman is usually in the top 10 to 12 rankings of American presidents. Two-termer, basically, one term and then another elected term. And today Truman's popularity rating is much higher than it would have been at the time that he left office. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go forward. Now, I mentioned, and most of you have already written this down. Truman, was an active leader. He was not really a progressive as much as he was a moderate government. Keep in mind, he's an old school Democrat, so he's not like full blown initially FDR style, but because of the Great Depression and the New Deal, he has certainly supported being a more active role in government, and he's going to continue that while being president. And I mentioned the other day that one of the problems with the way our book is organized is it doesn't mention really Yalta, and Yalta occurs in 44, right? So even before Truman is president, this is a weird book. Like, here's Harry Truman, and now let's talk about FDR, who came before him. So Yalta is the singular event that I want you guys to know that kind of starts the Cold War. Now, there's no definitive exact moment when the Cold War begins, but this is the moment when Stalin basically is occupying, the Soviet Union is occupying Eastern Europe, right? Poland, Bulgaria, Romania. And Stalin says they'll have elections. And he later doesn't do that. Later on, there is no free election in the Eastern bloc of Europe, in Eastern Europe, okay? Now, at the same time, this criticism of FDR is that he's selling out Europe and China, because we're not going to make steps in Korea or in China at the time, to get the communists out, right? But the argument, I think, is pretty thin on this, because no one really seriously was considering, maybe Patton was seriously considering attacking the Soviet Union. Patton considered it heavily. He actually wanted to do this. He thought as soon as the war ended in Europe, they should just start the next war against the communists. But just as I mentioned about Patton, unfortunately, Patton's going to die in a bizarre automobile accident. His car is going to run into a horse-drawn cart in Germany, and he's going to die in a car crash. So Patton is no longer alive by the time World War II ends, or right after World War II ends, excuse me. So nonetheless, Stalin at Yalta, it recognizes he's in a position of power, and he has this area of Eastern Europe that is occupied by the Soviet Union, and he has no intention of leaving. He recognizes that not only is it further than the old Russian Empire, it actually would create what we would call today a buffer zone, because Russia has been attacked twice already in the 20th century. And so he's like, I don't want to ever again have to face a threat from Western Europe to the Soviet Union. The problem is FDR can't really negotiate something from a position of weakness. They can't tell Stalin to leave. So that's why Yalta is sometimes seen as a betrayal, because they have to make concessions that they're hoping that Stalin will honor, recognizing he probably won't. FDR and Churchill knew that he probably would not let the people of Poland say, get out communism, and they didn't, unfortunately. So we're looking at the beginning of the Cold War. And, if we go down the list here, what did the big three agree to do at Yalta and Stalin didn't do? So here you can see there would be free elections in the East. The Soviets would attack Japan eventually. And, the idea is that, unfortunately, the West, the Allies, cannot stop the Soviets from occupying Eastern Europe. So keep that in mind. That's why it's usually turned out to be the beginning of the Cold War. Let's talk now about the origins of U.S. and Soviet distrust. So I think we should probably look at this as a list, and I do have a list here. So one of the things about the Cold War that's so important, first of all, it's called cold. I think y'all know this, but it's called cold because the two guys, the two rivals, the two big powers, the two superpowers, as they're sometimes called, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, do not actually directly fight each other. So there's no hot war between the two superpowers. We call it a Cold War. It's a war of beliefs, of ideology, right? So we have in the East, the Soviets and the countries they control, which are often called a bloc. So this is the Eastern Bloc, or the country that are behind what Churchill will call an iron curtain. Iron meaning like tanks and weapons to control them. These are sometimes called satellite states, these countries that are they're not directly part of the Soviet Union, but they sort of orbit the Soviet Union's satellite, like moons around a larger body. So these are the satellite nations of Poland and East Germany and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Romania and Bulgaria. So they're going to be all occupied by the Soviets. Okay. The problem is with the Cold War has a lot of reasons, but another one of the reasons is both communism and capitalism are almost like religions in the sense that both groups, both the communists and American, democratic and capitalist, want to spread our beliefs to other people. So we call them evangelical. Communism wants to be Marx called it industrial workers of the world unite, or workers of the world unite. Okay, so it's a global movement, and of course America, has said we want to make the world safe for democracy, and we promote democracy around the world. So just like Christianity and Islam come into conflict because they're proselytizing, they're evangelical, they try to spread. If you're trying to spread, you're going to run into other people who are trying to spread. And so, but the real reason is they are diametrically opposed to each other. So communism is a form of dictatorial command economy, a dictatorial socialist society, okay, under Stalin. Now, maybe Marx had hoped that it would be a dictatorship of the proletariat, a utopian society that would never have any sort of classes, but that's not what had happened. It just was a dictatorship. The masses never ran the Soviet Union. It was not the dictatorship of the proletariat. It was the revolution of the vanguard, which means guys like Stalin governed with an iron fist. That's not what Marxism was supposed to do. So a lot of times we call Soviet era communism Stalinism, okay? Because it's just like in China, it's called Maoism. It's the distinctive brand of communism that's imprinted on the countries they govern. Right. And so, whenever we talk about communism or capitalism, there's really rarely, if ever, been a true example of a pure either of those. I mean, maybe America in the 1880s was a purely capitalist society, i.e. no government intervention, no regulation, anything like that. Hasn't had much, right, if it's ever happened. So capitalism is based on freedom, based on free markets. Democracy is based on freedom. It's based on individuality, free choice. Keep in mind, most Marxists view capitalists as imperialists, right? As aggressive expansionists. But at the same time, there are other differences. So not only is communism a command economy, right, which means the government runs the economy, it was an actual dictatorship, and it was also atheistic. And I do want to draw on this a lot, because while today in America atheism is sort of more popular, I guess you would say, in the 1950s, it absolutely wasn't popular, all right? So one of the things you're going to see a lot against communism are ministers. Pastors are going to preach against it, right? So America, free market, mostly democratic, and very religious, or free, religious freedom. Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, I don't think anybody's arguing that this wasn't the state making people be. Definitely, like if you think about Russian Orthodoxy, was not, people still were Russian Orthodox, but they weren't supposed to be. So yeah, it's just like in the French Revolution, the French outlawed Christianity, outlawed Catholicism. Well, people were still Catholic; they just weren't allowed to practice it in public. So yeah. But the thing about it is, frequently the communists would persecute religious people. So it's not simply saying we're atheistic, it's saying we don't allow religious freedom. So it's like atheistic by policy. Keep in mind, Marx had said that religion is opiate for the masses. Religion is a drug to calm the masses. So Marx is typically, if they're ideological, and you should know this word, it means a system of beliefs. So at the core of the Cold War is a struggle between value systems. And keep in mind, most people hadn't really worked out these things in depth. So, it was the idea that they're trying to spread a geopolitical influence for their own benefit. Honestly, Stalin could care less about spreading Marxism. Stalin was never an avowed communist. He was very serious about Soviet Union control. And so for him, it wasn't about having communists as much as it was having people that were puppets, people that would do whatever he told them to do. So that's why they had to be communist. And again, Stalin was communist, don't get me wrong, but this was more about him than it was about a belief system. Now, some of our past had not particularly been beneficial. So these are some of the things we didn't do, right? So one of the things we didn't do is under Wilson, all the way up until the 1930s, until FDR, was recognize the Soviet Union. So like for 20 years, the United States had said the Soviet Union isn't a country. The government of the Soviet Union should not exist. And it's kind of like today, the nation state of Iran refuses to accept the nation state of Israel. Right. Well, that's kind of like what we were doing. We were not recognizing the Soviet Union as a country. So obviously, if you're communist in the Soviet Union, you're like, well, that sucks. We don't like you for that. Plus, not only did we not recognize them, President Wilson had actually sent troops to Russia to stop the Bolshevik Revolution. You understand? To help the whites defeat the Reds. So we actually helped fight communism already. Yeah. The delay in the opening of the Second Front. So by that, I mean, by dragging our feet in North Africa and Italy, from Stalin's perspective, he believed that we were doing that intentionally. Like we were trying not to get to Germany very much because the Germans were killing so many Soviets. Keep in mind, the Soviet Union had more people dead than any other nation state by far. Fourth, and this is a big deal too, we did not include the Soviets at all in the Manhattan Project. So even though they were our allies, we told the Brits we were developing the atom bomb. We told the Free French, de Gaulle and those guys were developing the atom bomb. We didn't tell the Russians. Included themselves? Well, they spied, right, if that's what you mean by espionage. They weren't there legitimately, but we didn't invite them. And then lastly, this question of, during the war, they accepted Lend-Lease because it was primarily for military. After the war, and we're going to go over this policy in just a few minutes, there's going to be a major attempt to rebuild Europe, and it's going to be paid for by America. But the Soviets aren't going to take the Marshall Plan money because they think it's going to come with strings attached that will undermine communism. Like observers and Americans walking around checking, you know what I'm saying? Like there's too much risk they felt of having American influence in the Soviet Union, at least for Stalin. So lots of things. So at the end of the day, and certainly when we get down to later leaders like Truman's policies, you're going to learn about George Kennan. George Kennan was a professor at Harvard in international studies who wrote the sort of definitive white paper on Soviet Union. He spent time in the State Department in the Soviet, or in, dealing with Russia. And so he wrote a seminal work, and you do need to know George Kennan's name, that said that the American government had to understand that the Soviet Union was expansionist. That was its agenda, to expand its influence and to spread communism. And therefore, Kennan's paper will shape American foreign policy for the next 40 years. For the next 40 years, we're going to be preventing the spread of communism as an objective, or almost 50 years. And that's called containment. So you may have heard of this before, but think of it as like initially we recognize there's no way we're going to get communism out of the Soviet Union at this time in history. So our goal was not to get rid of communism, as much as we would like to have done that. Our goal is at very least to roll it to where it is and no longer, like don't let it spread, contain it like a virus. Okay, so that was what happened a lot under the Cold War. And so I want you to keep this big umbrella in mind, particularly when we do our last DBQ of the year, which is on the Cold War. All right, so you should definitely know its background, its context, all right, context. So, this is that kind of paragraph or section. So why did Stalin view a Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe as essential? It's pretty easy. Stalin recognized that the Soviet Union had been attacked twice from Western Europe. And if you went back even further, Napoleon invaded Russia in the 1800s. The Crimean War was Western Europe against Russia. It seemed as if the West, particularly Britain, France, now the United States, were opposed to the Soviet Union. It didn't seem, we were opposed to it. So that's one of the key parts of the Cold War. Okay. And, we viewed this, by the way, as Americans, as imperialism. We saw what the Soviets did in Eastern Europe as sort of like a violation of what World War I was about. World War I created Poland, right? World War II, the Soviet Union occupied Poland, and they didn't leave. And so Poland was not a free country. Hungary was not a free country. And so this to us looked like an empire, being spread over Eastern Europe. And that's, of course, not what we wanted to see happen in World War II. Similarities between our countries. I think there's a paragraph in the book that's pretty interesting. Both countries were largely isolated, so I should make how were we similar? Similarities between U.S. and Soviets. So I've mentioned already that both of us were sort of evangelical, but initially both of us were historically isolationist. After the Crimean War, which is the 1850s, the Soviet Union the Russians pretty much withdrew from European stuff. That's why they missed out on the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so both have been isolationists. All right, both had what is called, and this is what I meant about evangelical, missionary diplomacy, and by that it means we weren't Switzerland anymore. I think back to America pre-Teddy Roosevelt. Basically, we were like Switzerland with the Monroe Doctrine. We were the Western Hemisphere's big Switzerland. Under TR, we were the Western Hemisphere's big Germany or France or America. We took over and dominated the Western Hemisphere, right? But it was still just that half of the world. That was our half, Monroe to TR. But after World War II, we utterly have abandoned, right, any isolationist view. Like, not any. A lot of Americans are still isolation, but Americans, by and large, had spread democracy as a vision. So you could think of like Taft with dollar diplomacy. All right. Anybody who tried to spread American values, this was sort of exporting our views, right? What else was we both misunderstood each other. And I've read several books that said, had we just really talked to each other, this would not have been nearly as bad. The problem was we couldn't talk in a way where we were so distrustful, right? Both countries will emerge as the most powerful in the world. right? So what I mean by that is, now the cost for the Soviet Union to be powerful was 20 million dead Russians. That's Stalin's domestic plan. That's the 5-year plans, okay? But they were an industrial superpower. Not only were they a military superpower, they were an economic superpower in the start. We were an economic superpower. We had emerged industrially and militarily stronger than we had started the war. So we were in a rare position to be the only sort of two players on the scene. Now, keep in mind, before World War II started, Britain and France are the world's two largest empires, right? After World War II, they don't have empires. They've lost them, basically. So this was another interesting similarity, right? So if we could have found a way to work out our differences, then maybe life would have been better. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. We really just did not trust each other. And part of that has to do with Harry Truman. Part of that has to do with Stalin. Part of that has to do with the media of its day. Part of that has to do with the U.S. Congress. So there's all kinds of factors. But unfortunately, both sides were working from a not understanding the other well. Now, I don't think Kennan is wrong. Kennan did see this as expansionism. But for Stalin, it's not simply to take over countries for the resource. Not a whole lot of resources in Poland, all right? But it's for the protection buffer. Never again does he want the Soviet Union to be attacked in Russia, right? Like, that's not going to happen, you think. So a lot of differences between these two, but a lot of similarities too. So in the midst of all this, in the midst of the Cold War, in fact, actually during World War II, this thing happens. And so if I ask you about wartime conferences, I'm not asking about this. This is actually, if I ask you about an economic conference during World War II, this is held in New Hampshire at a resort called Bretton Woods. And folks, today we live under the Bretton Woods system. So let that phrase sink in. The global economy that we are now a part of is called the Bretton Woods system. And it's here in the United States, in New Hampshire, during World War II. We do this. And we're planning the post-war economy of the world. So we host it. And at this meeting called Bretton Woods, we create several international cooperative organizations. The thing that's the beginning is this thing that's called International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Now, no one calls it that anymore. Everybody calls it the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. This thing is now known as the World Bank. And that's literally what is created at the Bretton Woods. The World Bank, by the way, one of the most influential people at this meeting will be a guy named John Maynard Keynes. You remember him? The Keynesian economist from Britain, the guy that he'll be at this. So the Americans and the Brits particularly lead the way on this. And what they're trying to do is to stabilize a rate of exchange for currency between the world. Remember, they tried to do this during the Depression, it didn't work. But also, one of their biggest concerns is the debt of poor countries. Like, how do we help poor countries get going, particularly after World War II? And so to help, they create this World Bank so that if you follow the rules of the bank, this bank will loan countries money. And the money that's in the World Bank are deposited from the strong nations. So the strong nations of the world, economically, will now loan money through this international institution to the less strong countries for the purpose of economic development and growth. Now, critics of this thing will say the strings that are attached are so tough that countries that adopt this have to cut all social programs. And it is true. It is a very Western program, meaning that the conditions for borrowing money from the World Bank mean that you don't get to have a rich social system, a socialistic system. You understand? Social safety net, things like that. So this is why some people criticize it. But nonetheless, the IMF is the lending arm of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. And it is what it sounds like. It's the nations, the rich nations of the world can make loans to countries and then help them stabilize their payment plan. So try to think of things like the Dawes Plan wrapped up with the idea of a global bank. And really this thing is still very much a powerful institution in the world, the IMF and the World Bank. Because one of the things that World War II is going to end is imperialism. And so you're going to have all these countries in Africa and in Southeast Asia and Central Asia becoming independent from British and French and German rule. And they don't have any money because the Europeans exploited them. They took all their money, all their valuable stuff before they became independent. So this is a really great thing to some people. Other people see it as critical. But nonetheless, this will be the beginning of the transformation too of the US dollar becoming the currency of the world. It hasn't happened yet. At this time in history, we're back on the gold standard, okay? And the world's doing trade on the gold standard, but so many countries don't have any gold, and we're going to see them shifting away to what we now have, which is called a fiat currency, which means we're going to make more money than we use gold to back, paper money, you know. And then eventually in 1970, we're going to go off the gold standard for good, right? Like we have been on this for 50 years, but you know, this will be that during this period. Now, one of the most important events, maybe in modern history, starts in San Francisco in April of 1945. So the beginning of the United Nations is formed at a conference called the San Francisco Conference. You might want to know that. San Francisco Conference. So that's where it was formed. And at the conference, they created this brand new, very similar initially to the League of Nations, but some major differences that we're going to take a look at now. So similarity, there is what is called, you know, and by the way, the UN today it's a beautiful modern, well, it's no longer a modern building, but at the time it was a modern building, which is located on the East River in Manhattan, in New York City. So if you ever, and I usually take students to tour it when we're up there, this is what the UN looks like. I'll show you. So that's the sort of graphic of the UN structure. This is the UN as a physical. And so when this building, I think it's Corbusier who built it, but I forget for sure who the architect is. But nonetheless, when this thing was built, it was cutting edge and brand new. So, and it's located in New York City. So that should tell you the conference to form it was in United States, San Francisco, and it's headquartered in the United States. So pretty clear who's going to be a member of it this time, right? Yeah, I think we might be in this one. Okay, so we're enthusiastically supportive of it. Most people were, and the UN is going to start off doing pretty well, but I want to explain a few things about what the structure of the UN is. So the General Assembly is consistent with the League of Nations, that every country in the world sends an ambassador to the United Nations. So this is where the ambassador, our UN ambassador, sits. So if you ever see pictures of like the countries with a little placard like US, and yeah, I'll show you a picture of them sitting in the General Assembly. It's this big, beautiful room. It's golden, and the hall is, and all these people are there, and they all have like earphones in. And if you want to learn to speak a bunch of languages, they'll pay you a lot of money, and you can live in New York and work for the United Nations. So this is a UN General Assembly room right here. This beautiful, big, golden, kind of shiny room. They've had to modernize it some because it was built, in the 50s, and they didn't change anything. It's the chairs and carpet and everything are like from the 50s. So they've had to modernize it a little bit recently. Nobody wanted to pay for, like UN building upkeep, but this is where all the leaders of the world sit, right? And some of the great moments in history have been American or foreign dignitaries standing right here and delivering a speech to the whole world. That's who they're talking to, all the leaders of the world, really. So that's pretty neat. But the major difference between this United Nations and the League of Nations, which existed before, is the formation of this. Let me show you all this, and then you'll see what's the difference. Okay, I'll do that one more time. I get frustrated. So this is appearing. There we go. The UN Security Council, with its beautiful murals. You see the murals on the back of all the. I'm not sure who did that one, but there are a bunch of Norman Rockwell paintings in this building, like originals. So this is the group of people that have the voting authority, I'll get there eventually, of committing force. So we call this semicircular group sitting at a table the UN Security Council. Everybody have that? The UN Security Council. Sorry, I got to move this stuff. Creation of the UN. Got to pack it all into one slide, y'all. Yeah, right. Keep it busy. So these 15 countries sit around and they can vote to send troops into war for the world. So that's a very important thing. So I want you to know who the 5 permanent members of the Security Council are. See, there are 10 that rotate every 2 years, right? They rotate on and off of the Security Council, but 5 of them are there all the time. And it kind of makes sense who the five are if you think about who the end of World War II is. So make sure you write these down. Obviously, USA, right? The British, the Soviet Union, and France. So those four make sense because they were the allies. And the fifth at the time was nationalist China. Okay, pre-communist China. Now it's communist China. And it's no longer the Soviet Union, it's Russia. But those are the five votes that are always permanent. You understand? The other 10, like in this picture I saw, Nigeria was there, and other countries are there. But five members always vote. And those five members each have a veto. Now you think about it. That means the United States and the Soviet Union are on the same body, which approves war, right? Not going to be any UN military action against the Soviet Union or America, right? Because we could vote, veto. A single veto kills any authorization of troops. So it's meant to be, you got to come together and agree. So we have actually had UN military action. We'll see that in Korea, but it's not that often. The UN rarely engages a military, and we do have troops that go to the UN, but under our law, we have to be in charge. So we will not submit American troops to a non-American led force, which is interesting. They can, like we can command Canadians and other stuff, but we're kind of the big dog, so we don't do that. But that's the UN Security Council. So these are the two most important parts right here, right? So you have the Security Council and the General Assembly. But you had other entities that you should know as well. And so, for example, they had UNESCO. All right, UNESCO. So let me go through each one, and then I'll be able to explain it to you better. But the thing about the goal of the United Nations is not only to promote peace and stability, but they also want to encourage things like education and science. So the idea is to promote basically an improvement for the world. So let's write down a few things that actually the UN does well. All right. First of all, there are violent conflicts that erupt in Iran and in Kashmir, which is the territory between India and Pakistan. And the United Nations negotiates and brings an end to those conflicts during this early decade. Okay, they keep peace, so it won't turn into an entire war in those two regions. The United Nations authorizes the creation of the State of Israel. The first modern State of Israel is formed by the UN. I consider that a success. Maybe some people don't, but that's
it's debatable. It's like I've seen a lot of stuff recently about Israeli soldiers and Israeli police attacking Palestinians.
Sure, but 1947, the Jewish homeland was an objective.
Yeah.
And they were created out of a UN supervised Palestine, which of course that's an argument that whether that should have happened or not. But pretty much the people in the United States who are allies with Israel, which we are, and supporters of it, and much of the world, the fact that they didn't just invade and seize it, but rather that was a divided country there were Palestinians would be able to live. Initially, I think if the UN model had stuck, then life would have been a whole lot better, but it didn't. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Now, the UNESCO stands for UN Educational Science and Culture Organization. It promotes science, particularly, and education. FAO, this is, let's see if I can remember when I last, this is the food program. The FAO, Food and Agriculture is what it translates to. But when I was in Honduras, I would go to little like rural schools, right? And you would go into these like tiny little schools in these kind of nowhere places, right? And in the back, you would see, sitting in bags, rice and grain, and it would be labeled like this. And that is FAO rice. So in other words, the UN would send food to third world countries. So rice, beans, kind of stuff that can be stored dry and then eaten, once people put it in water. So definitely that had made a huge difference in the lives of millions of people. The World Health Organization, WHO, that has made a huge difference in the world. And certainly something that you need to keep note of is the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Somewhere John Locke was jumping in his grave, right? Like, this is the idea, so voted on by the world. Now, I know, again, it's a scrap of paper if you consider how some countries have handled it. But the idea that the world believes everyone has rights. That's pretty amazing. That's a long ways away from where we started in the Enlightenment, right? You know, the idea that all people are created equal. So, by the way, the person who co-chaired that committee was former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. So she was, like I said, the most active First Lady in history. And in the end, the UN does a pretty good job on everything but one major problem. And so there's this concept called the Baruch Plan, which is co-signed by a whole lot of nuclear physicists and atomic scientists. And it was a program to propose getting rid of atomic weapons altogether. Like, in other words, okay, we've used them, but now we'll never use them again. Like, we know what they do. And it would have required probably some sort of what we have today, by the way, which is a nuclear regulatory agency, an agency to investigate when countries are creating nuclear weapons or nuclear programs. Unfortunately, America was not behind our own delegates' idea. And more importantly, the Soviet Union was really not behind it. All right. So Truman didn't like the idea because we were the only one who had a nuke at the time. We're like, why would we give up the nuke? We're the ones who have it. Nobody else does. The Soviets were like, it's a trick to keep us from having it. So this never happened. And so I think had we gotten the nuclear specter out of the Cold War early, then we might have been able to end it much sooner.
Yeah.
And save trillions of dollars in the process and a lot of frightened people. But that didn't happen. So that was called the Baruch Plan, named after Bernard Baruch, who was our delegate to the UN. Fought like a land war, World War III. It's possible. I think if you look at what we do in Korea, it's possible to fight a contained war during this period. You know, you could do it. You could fight a contained war in Poland, but I'm glad we didn't. You know, because it's highly unlikely that would have happened. Right? I mean, we fought a contained war in Vietnam. You know, and that was why what both Presidents Truman and LBJ wanted to do is not let the war become a global conflict. Right? So that's the problem, is that you kind of can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't complain about not invading the Soviets or not bombing China and then not want World War III. You know, if you do those two things, you're going to start World War III. So that's going to be an interesting point. Yeah. Now, I mentioned yesterday that one of the things that is new is the creation of a program to investigate and try the Nazis. Now, the place is called Nuremberg. Now, Nuremberg wasn't picked by accident. Nuremberg was home to the Nazi headquarters, where like the Nazi Party's headquarters were. And you may be familiar with the Nuremberg laws, right? The laws that restricted Jewish, citizenship, the sort of Jim Crow laws that predated the Holocaust. Well, we are going to capture, among others, Rudolf Hess, the guy who was the personal secretary to Hitler, Hermann Goering, who will end up killing himself during the trial. He'll have a guard who will actually smuggle him a poison pill and he'll take a poison. We put quite a few of the German masterminds, so to speak, of the Holocaust on trial for crimes against humanity. And that's a new term. That's a new phrase because that had never happened before. Now, the Holocaust was not the first genocide of the 20th century. All right, but it was the first that was overtly discovered during the time. And, the Ottomans were never prosecuted for what they did to the Armenians. And in fact, Hitler very famously said to a subordinate who asked him about it, nobody remembers the Armenians because, they got slaughtered by the Ottomans. And while some newspapers reported it, most people didn't pay any attention to it. So this time around, we're not going to let that happen. So we put these guys on trial. And they're put on trial because they create. These are judges we put on trial. These are political officials we put on trial. And the accusation is that you are the people that made the laws that made the Holocaust possible. Yeah. Okay, you're the ones who actually. Now, some of them are the camp administrators. The commandants of like Buchenwald, for example, were put on trial. So these are the architects and participants that they could capture of the Holocaust. Now, interestingly, the guy who actually creates the Holocaust, the guy who plans it, is a guy named Adolf Eichmann, and he escapes from Germany to Argentina. And he will later be captured by the Israelis in an extraordinary, like secret raid, and then taken out of Argentina all the way to Israel and put on trial there, right? But this is a very important moment, and we have an American judge, we have a British judge, and we have a French judge, and our military provides the prosecution, and they're afforded an attorney. They get, they're able to cross-examine witnesses, and the evidence is overwhelming that these people crafted and enacted the laws that led to the death of 7 million people, all right, or 6.5 million people. And so some of these people will be put to death, executed. Some will be in prison for years, different sentences depending on who they were. So this was a very important moment. And it was in many ways the first time a lot of people outside of the war saw what had happened to the Jewish people, saw the Holocaust in reality from newsreels and things like that. So definitely know the Nuremberg trials, okay? Now, one of the things about the Cold War is it's absolutely easy to recognize it on maps, right? Because you'll usually see on a test of some sort a map that has this red line drawn through it. And so it'll be shaded. On this side is this, on this side is that. So, lots of different maps. In fact, I'll stick a couple up here just so you guys can visualize this that are watching it. Lots of maps of divided Europe in the Cold War, right? And so what's usually appropriated as the phrase to this division, so here's a good one, looks like about the same kind I would make. Try that one. Good old Switzerland. You gotta love Switzerland, man. They seem to understand. Like, if I could do it over, maybe we'd be Switzerland, right? So you can see here, red, commies, blue, awesomeness. Here's one that it's the Cold War for kids. How about that, y'all? It's a kind of a yellowish color. It's for sickly, nasty people. And then a kind of pukey green. So, you can look at this. It's clearly a divided continent, right? Big shocker. And what you need to recognize is that what happened in these countries, right? What happened in these countries were the military was omnipresent. It was everywhere. And there were police that were part of the Communist Party. And there was suppression of any kind of freedom of voting, right? Like you weren't gonna be able to vote for some sort of democratic candidate. Freedom of speech was restricted. So civil liberties were oppressed, right? And these were countries, many of them, who had just become independent right before World War II. They'd either broken out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire or they were Poland, had gotten free from the Russian Empire. So, what's interesting too, by the way, if you pick up on this map, is there was one major communist country in the world who was not aligned with the Soviet Union, and that's Yugoslavia. So Yugoslavia was created after World War I, and it was communist, but it did not like the Soviet Union. Like they rejected the Soviet Union. So they were not a puppet of Stalin's. And this is one of the reasons why we know that communism was not like a universal team during the period. Clearly it was still involving countries. So definitely know that and know this red line that's present here that was, Winston Churchill, remember, gets voted out of office and he gives a speech. And you can actually hear that speech where he says from Stettin in the Balkans to the Trieste in the Adriatic. So down here's the Balkans, Stettin, and all the way up to Trieste, which is up here. An iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lies the ancient capitals of Central and Eastern Europe. So Europe, very, very divided, but so is Germany, okay? So is Germany. So know that Germany was also divided. Initially, West Germany, as it was called, and I actually had a chance to go to the West German embassy when I was literally your age. My junior year of high school, I signed up and went to this thing called the National Leadership Conference in Washington, D.C. And you got to go tour, among other places, the Pentagon. I got to go to the State Department. But one of the cool places we got to go to an embassy. And the embassy that was one that we got to go to was the West German embassy. So I actually have like brochures and packets I kept from 1989 because it was before the Cold War ended. So it's West Germany as a nation state. That's kind of crazy to think about now. But this was West Germany, and it was divided into a British zone, an American zone, and a French zone, right? So we were sort of occupying these territories with our military for their reconstruction. So it's very similar to what happened in the American Civil War, right? Very quickly, we abolish price controls and price ceilings and let free market take over, and West Germany's economy begins to recover dramatically, right? It takes off. Meanwhile, East Germany, the green, is a Russian zone, and they will not have free market. Now, within several months after the end of World War II and the creation of this, we will agree to let these three zones merge and become West Germany. So very quickly, our occupation will be reduced as a result of this. Although we have massive, even to this day, massive military bases in Germany, America does, especially air base. So Germany in the east is divided, but it's also divided here and then unified here. But you'll see that this is the city of Berlin. Berlin was the capital of Germany, you know, during the war, and Berlin is going to be divided, which is weird because if you look at where Berlin is, I told you yesterday, it's pretty close to the border of East Germany and Poland, right? So here's Berlin entirely within the East Soviet zone, East Germany, but Berlin's city-state was divided in half. So the half of the city of Berlin was democratic capitalist, and the other half was communist, right? And so you can imagine how weird that must have been. The city is entirely located in the communist zone, but half the city is free. So imagine if you're in Danville, and you guys know where Riverside Drive is, I imagine. So imagine that from Riverside Drive to us is free market, and on the other side of the river is communist, right? So what you might guess, and certainly it would not be a guess, is that people who lived in East Berlin would run away to live in West Berlin. But not only that, people in East Germany would run away to live in West Berlin. Didn't even have to get to West Germany. See, if here's East Germany, you ain't got to get all the way over here. All you got to do is get to here, right? So people were actually fleeing the communist zone and going into West Berlin. All right. So Stalin had a response for that. He blockaded the city. He shut down all road traffic, train traffic, and air traffic into the city of West Berlin, right? It's a blockade. And this is one of the very first challenges of the Cold War, one of the very first tests of what's our response going to be. Stalin is testing Harry Truman. All right, he's daring him to do something because nobody wants to be the guy who starts the Cold War, hot war. Nobody wants to be the guy who starts World War III, right? So Stalin's like, I'm going to blockade this, and they're going to have to let it go. In other words, West Berlin is going to become communist and part of East Berlin. Truman's like, well, we can't send troops in there. That'll trigger World War III, and we can't go bomb them. What can we do? So they bandy it around the State Department, and they come up with a brilliant idea, a foreign policy idea, and that is to drop thousands of tons of supplies on West Berlin, to fly civilian airplanes over, or military airplanes that are not armed, over West Berlin and drop them, you know, like parachutes down. So you have like candy drops, like the kids would come out and there would be candy bars that would be dropped in big boxes, right? And they dropped every day. This happened multiple times a day. They were flying in food and clothes, entertainment stuff. So the city of West Berlin kept going, like it just kept functioning purely by this airlift, it's called. So this is known in history as the Berlin airlift. All right. So the Soviets blockaded access to it, and America and our friends dropped not bombs, but actually dropped supplies for a year. And after a year, Stalin backed down. He was embarrassed. Like, clearly this wasn't working. And so we won sort of this first skirmish of the Cold War. But Truman did not allow it to become a military excursion. In other words, we didn't get into a hot war. So that's very cool, I think. Definitely know that, please. And the Berlin blockade and airlift was like the first test. Now you'll notice, and this should be pretty clear to you, that somewhere in history soon is going to be a wall built between these cities, right? Yeah. But it hasn't happened yet. The wall is not there yet. That's something that happens in the 1960s under President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev, right? So that's a different test at a different time. So don't please confuse these two events. The blockade is like the blockade of access into the city, roads, railroads, things like that. The wall, you know what a wall is, and I'll show you all that in the 60s. All right, so please know the Berlin airlift. Now, again, going back to communism, you definitely need to know this guy, George Kennan. So he was the Dean of International Studies at Harvard. So you know, when we talk about being an expert, he literally was an expert. He knew what he was about, and he had done most of his research on the Soviet Union. Interestingly enough, he was a scholar, an expert on that. And so when Kennan introduced this white paper, as they call them, or actually I shouldn't call it the white paper, they call it the long telegram. He wrote it in Foreign Affairs magazine. He published it secretly initially. So this is actually the magazine, which I don't get in print form anymore, but I used to get, and I'm actually going to do a meeting on this soon with this group. But this is something that we call the Council of Foreign Relations publication, which is called Foreign Affairs. And so this is in this, he published an essay as Mr. X, right? He was Mr. X. And, when he wrote it, because anonymously initially, because he was an ambassador who worked with the Soviets, he makes this long essay. It was an 8,000 word telegram. So, it's not a telegram, it's a freaking book. So he sends this long telegram back to America and says, look, we're going to have to approach this differently. All right. We're going to have to look at the Soviets as predominantly expansionist. You understand? Like, that's their agenda. That's what they're trying to accomplish, is to expand their scope. So as part of this, and I don't need you to write every single one of these down, but it's definitely good to get a familiar, big picture of the Cold War. So, one of our goals is to bring back a strong Western Europe to counterbalance the Soviet Union. Guys, the strongest country in Europe should not be the United States. You understand? And so we want to rebuild France, Germany, right? We want to rebuild Belgium, the British. They need to be a vibrant part of Europe to counteract the spread of communism, right? Because if they're weak, then people might become communists, like the actual people in the country. And that's worse in a way than an invasion, because that means the people are communists, in terms of our views, right? So that will bring back, and by us doing this, by the way, the Berlin airlift, you can see where we would fly in stuff. That sent a signal to Western Europe: we're going to not be isolationist. This is Truman's greatest fear, is that America after World War II is going to do what we've done after every other war, basically, which is to reduce our military. We always have done that in the past, right? Like, get rid of the military altogether, just about, and to turn our backs on wherever we were, Europe or Far East or whatever. And so Truman is very afraid that's going to happen. Critics of Truman's will say he actually amplifies the threat of the Cold War to keep Americans afraid. In other words, by scaring us, he keeps us from being isolation. That's an interesting argument to be made. Did he frighten us into being nervous? Nonetheless, Truman is concerned that America's past is isolation. And he knows that the British know our past is isolation. Yeah. So we need to show them that we're going to help them, right? And we also want to make sure that they can't spread communism. I have a few more comments down here. We want to see how we can negotiate with the Soviets, but at the same time reject communism, right? So is talking to someone you don't like a sign of approval? I argue no. You can talk to people you don't like. You can talk to people you don't agree with. In fact, we should, because we don't have to be enemies. We can just be adversaries or rivals or people with different points of view, right? That's not the same thing as an enemy. So we're concerned about that. And I mentioned here carrots and sticks. We want to be able to help Russia, but not let Russia expand its views. And it's kind of where we are today. President Biden yesterday slapped some sanctions on Russia. Well, we knew it was coming. I mean, they overtly have interfered in our elections. And Trump had sanctions on Russia too. But at the same time, we still talk to Russia. So it's kind of like, we don't want to get to the point where we're not talking to them and we have sanctions on them. That's where we are with Iran, right? And sort of with North Korea, Trump notwithstanding. So that's the worst case scenario, is to not be at all talking to the Soviets and not in any way dealing with them. That's an adversarial relationship. So we're kind of looking for what we're supposed to do. Now, I told you that the Berlin airlift was the first test, and really it was a 1-2 punch. You have this occur in Berlin. In the same year, you have the outbreak of a civil war in Greece. Now, in Greece, the problem is some of the rebels are communists. Okay. Meanwhile, down in Turkey, the Soviet Union is helping people in Turkey who are supporting communism, right? So you have two places in Southern Europe and the Middle East, Turkey and Greece. Sounds like a delicious Thanksgiving meal, right? So Turkey and Greece are being infiltrated, as our perspective, by communists. And it is very possible that those two countries could become communists. So Truman issues his doctrine. So you're definitely going to want to know what the Truman doctrine is, just like the Monroe Doctrine. And what the Truman Doctrine is, we will give financial aid. Keep that in mind. Financial, right? Like economic, numeric, dollar amounts. We will assist through money, free people to work out their own destiny against armed minorities or outside pressure. So the Truman Doctrine, simply put, is we will give financial aid to countries that are combating communism. And we give $400 million to these countries to stop, and it works. Greece and Turkey don't become communists. All right, and the details I'll let you read on your own if you're curious about it. But nonetheless, Truman has sort of drawn a line in the sand and says, we recognize the Soviet fingerprints on what's happening in these two countries. We're not going to let that happen. We're going to give money to the people that don't want that. So that becomes a Truman Doctrine. But even bigger than the Truman Doctrine, which is part of it, is an even bigger program called the European Recovery Program. And that is named after our Secretary of State. And this is one of the rare times in history where your five-star general, after the war, becomes the Secretary of State. So even while he was secretary, he was often called general instead of secretary, because he was General Marshall, right? So General Marshall, now Secretary Marshall, who of course had spent time in Europe and saw the devastation of World War II, understood sort of like intrinsically that people who are struggling will turn to whoever offers a solution. You understand? And there was a grave concern politically in places like France, West Germany, and Britain, and Italians, that communism would sort of get elected because life was so bad. World War II was so devastating. There was not going to be a New Deal, so to speak, for these countries, right? Because they're broke and decimated. So he said, and I really believe this was brilliant, we should aid any country from the war that needs it to rebuild. So the European Recovery Program is a physical rebuilding of Europe. And I told you the Truman Doctrine was 400 million, right? The Marshall Plan was 12.5 billion with a B. And it was a spectacular success. I mean, it is a massive success. So when you think about modern Germany today, unlike World War I, where they got slapped with reparations, I mean, there's no doubt Hitler caused World War II, right? Well, we didn't punish Germany after the war. We didn't slap them around and say, how dare y'all cause World War II, Instead, we're like, all right, purge yourself of Nazism. It's time to recover. And I give the Germans credit. They fully embrace democracy, the West Germans, right? And capitalism. So they're like, this didn't work. Let's try what the Americans are selling, And of course, we gave them a lot of money to help make it work better. Guys, it's a rule of thumb. I would emphasize people do not assume democracy is an automatic. If the circumstances economically do not make it viable, people will turn to fascism, communism, any other ism you can imagine. The beauty of democracy is you can govern yourself. But if people can't support themselves, they'll turn to someone who's offering a different option. So this is the U.S. government helping out these countries not become communists. It was a great program, Marshall Plan. Now, another key component of the Cold War is massive, and I do mean massive, expenditures in the military. So if you look here, you would expect when you're $80 billion during World War II, that makes sense, right? Yeah. So immediately after the war, it plummets. We're going to have a fire sale of weapons and stuff. We're going to get rid of all of it, just about, right? The wartime stuff. But take a look what happens right in the middle of Truman's presidency. He's like, wait a minute, that probably wasn't a great idea. So we're going to now be spending $50 billion, and then we're not in World War II. So one of the hallmarks of post-World War II is that we're going to continue to spend tens of billions of dollars a year annually on military expenditures, right? This becomes what Eisenhower would call the military-industrial complex. And I'll talk about NSC 68 on Tuesday. All right, so let's look at the National Security Act of 1947. Actually, it's like it's changed sequence here a little bit. So let me pull this up to here. All right. your book has changed the order a little bit. So let's go down and look at how the United States military is reorganized. So if you ever hear the Defense Department, this is the year it started. So up until 1947, we had what was called a Secretary of War, the War Department, and as another cabinet level, a Secretary of the Navy. But now defense is going to be our objective. So we rename and rebrand the War Department. We're not at war, we're at defense. So we create the Defense Department, which will have a Pentagon as a brand new home. So the Pentagon is located right here in Virginia, right across the river from Washington, D.C. It's the largest building in the world in terms of square footage. And it is an absolute, astonishing building. Like if you've never been in it, it is really neat. Let me show you a picture of an aerial photo of the Pentagon. Pentagon was attacked on 9/11, you might remember. And, the inner ring guys, the E-ring guys and stuff didn't even feel it. So to give you an idea of how enormous this place is, I'll let you see it with cars. Yeah. So, I mean, you could fly a commercial jet into one side of it and they don't. Now, the people in that side of the Pentagon felt it. Oh, yeah. But, I mean, you can see these little cars down here, right? So this is like an enormous structure. And as you get closer and closer to this inner ring is where like all the top secret gurus are. So that's the Pentagon. You can't tour it. Well, you couldn't tour it for about 10 years after 9/11. But I think it's not, well, now it's not because of COVID, but I think you can go in it now, in terms of like, I think they've reopened tours. Now you don't get to go far. It's kind of like, hey, this is what we do. But millions of people work in and around this thing. Look at the parking lot out here, right? There's a subway station under it. So it's a massive structure. Now, in the White House, you have the National Security Council created. So we have a National Security Counselor is the person who gives the daily briefing to the President of the United States on defense, or national security issues. Every day he gets a security briefing. Okay. And the National Security Advisor is a presidential appointment, and they have an office in the White House. So the president wants to be routinely updated to what's going on that affects our security. We also created a brand new intelligence gathering agency called the CIA. Right now, this intelligence is one of those funny words that students who haven't ever heard it in military terms aren't necessarily sure. What intelligence means is information about something that you want gathered. So the CIA's rule, its job is to gather information about foreign countries. That's all. That's all it's tasked with doing. Now, during the Cold War, it's going to change from just gathering information, to intervention, so to speak. But that's not its purpose. It wasn't created to be a government regime changer or a coup d'etat plotter, but it will end up doing some of that. We create a radio station called Voice of America, sometimes called Radio Free Europe. And it was American, rock and roll. We broadcast on it. It's kind of like American news stories, but it's like, this is what freedom smells like, or sounds like in terms of, and we broadcast it from sort of towers in Europe directly into the Soviet Union. We made sure that the broadcast was big enough to be heard all the way to the states behind the Iron Curtain. So it was a way to kind of keep them informed. And of course, it was a bit of propaganda as well. And then lastly, and certainly not least, we created something called selective service. Now, selective service is when you turn 18, you have to register for the draft. Okay, now that's not the same thing as being drafted. I registered for selective service when I was 18, right? It just means that, you report back to the federal government that you exist. And in terms of a military draft. Now, the government has has stopped the draft since 1974. But, for the better part of 20 years, 30 years, this will be a lot of American young people will register for this. Okay. And still, you still register for it now, but like I said, we hadn't had the draft in 50 years. Okay. So definitely be familiar with these 5 agencies. And then let's talk about another thing we do in 1948 and 9, which is the creation of the very first permanent military alliance for the United States. So it's called, for students who missed this up, unfortunately, it's not North American, it's North Atlantic. Now, there are some North American countries in it, like us, the United States, and Canada, but it's pretty much the West. This is a military alliance of the West. And guys, NATO is still very active today. NATO is the guys that were mostly involved in our U.S. forces with NATO in Afghanistan. NATO is very active in defending Spain, France, Britain from terrorist attacks. So NATO is our very first permanent, as of now, permanent military alliance, or more importantly, a peacetime military. We're not formally in a war, and yet we're in a military alliance. All right, and so NATO, and we today totally are accustomed to this NATO, but it was not normal back then. All right, so I'm gonna jump us down to Japan. I think I have it here. Yeah. And China, and then I think I'm still in sequentially order. So let me move some Middle Eastern stuff around for a second and then take you to post-war Japan. But here's post-war Japan. This picture, oh man, I read about this picture. So MacArthur was very familiar with the people of Japan. You know, he had lived in Asia for over a fourth of his life, and he understood how important it was to the Japanese to save face. But at the same time, he wanted to make sure they knew who was in charge. Now, he did not set up shop for himself in a imperial palace. He got a hotel, basically, and took a suite for his offices. You know, I mean, it was like a normal building. And he would not have armed guards with him in Japan. He's like, these people have to recognize that we're in this together, you know. So you can see he didn't wear like decorations. And the emperor, and that's who that is. That's Emperor Hirohito in that picture. It was very nervous about this picture. He's very nervous about going and meeting the general. We would call him a governor at this time. And he was afraid that he would be like humiliated, like the General MacArthur would tease him or something. And he absolutely didn't. MacArthur, this is one of his finest moments, is how well he manages his time in Japan. And if you want to get a good example of how to reconstruct a country, read the book on how this happened with the Japanese. Now, if the Japanese had not been supportive of it, it would have been a totally different story. So the beauty of this story is that the Japanese said, man, we screwed up. When you nuke a country a couple of times, they kind of come to, hey, we might have been wrong on this, right? So they utterly reject militarism. This is beautiful. They go from being a almost completely militarist country, all right, to no military. So that's like, wow. So they created a new constitution with MacArthur's oversight. Like he and his staff work with the Japanese, and they make a brand new constitution still in effect. They have a parliament, which we call a diet, and a prime minister. So today, when the United States president meets with the Japanese leader, it ain't the emperor he's meeting with. It's the prime minister of Japan. So they become a democratic republic, and they keep the emperor remains the emperor, but we would say today that's a ceremonial position. Like in other words, it's kind of like the Queen of England. That she doesn't actually govern England to speak of, but they have sort of a ceremonial purpose. It's the tradition of the country, the long-standing tradition. So MacArthur does a great job in Japan, I think, a relatively great job, and it works because today, if you think about the Japanese, we provide a guarantee for Japan's security. So we're going to have a huge naval base and military base at Okinawa. Remember that island we fought for? And there's going to be an American presence in Japan to this day. Like we are very much the defender of Japan. That's one of the reasons why we have so much tension with North Korea, and China. But nonetheless, this turns out to be very successful. So the Japanese don't have to spend any money on defense. So while we're spending a fourth of our money on defense, they're spending none. So you're going to have this. They call it the Asian tiger, this Japanese recovery. That's extraordinary, as will the West Germans. Okay. Now, I mentioned yesterday that there were war crimes trials, and Tojo was put on trial. Both Tokyo and Nuremberg was to send a message to other countries in the future that you cannot do this. Like this, if you do this, your leaders will be punished for this. And by this, I mean what they did in China, what they did to American POWs, the use of chemical experiments on prisoners, what the Germans did to the Jewish prisoners, So, this kind of stuff is absolutely, the problem is, and I'll tell you what happens, but the Germans and the Japanese who are the lawyers, are going to defend these arguments by saying there was no law saying we couldn't do this. So we didn't break any law, right? Like there's no law against what we did. Like what law did we violate? And that's where you get this crimes against humanity phrase. Like it's the unspoken law of nature or the spoken law of nature. Remember that life and liberty kind of idea? So very important message to the rest of the world for the future that we say we won't tolerate. Okay. Now, extraordinarily, America is going to see another communist country emerge, which is the most populated country on earth. And this is a huge moment in the Cold War because the Chinese Revolution / Civil War had been going on since 1911. Sun Yat-sen took over in 11 and got rid of the Qing dynasty. So from 1911 to 1949, you had nationalists who had control, like Chiang Kai-shek, but you also had his rival, who was Mao Zedong. That's why it says Mao's revolution. Mao Zedong, so I should say Mao Zedong's revolution, so some of y'all maybe know who that is. Mao was very much a peasant communist who was very charismatic. Unlike Stalin, who had kind of come through the ranks as a thug, Mao was more of a visionary peasant. I guess that's the way to describe it. Like a leader who led by example. So Mao had survived a march around all of China. Like he and his followers had escaped Chiang's army, marched completely around China. So we're like talking about like a 3,000-mile march. A lot of the men died in this. But while they were doing that, he became sort of like a larger-than-life figure in China. And the people of China were under abject poverty. They were totally suffering under the nationalist government, just like they'd suffered under the imperial government. Chiang had proven to not be a very effective leader of China for the masses. Now, it was good for us, pro-democratic and anti-Japan in World War II. But there is going to become a narrative that exists throughout the Cold War that Truman lost China. So remember I told you that the criticism of the Democratic Party is they're soft on communism? Here's another sort of nail in the coffin, right? Like now you have a Democratic president who lost the world's largest country to communism. Now, I would argue that Truman was well aware of what was going on in China and could not stop it. And by that, I mean, he didn't lose China. Chiang Kai-shek lost China, right? Like the Chinese nationalists were not capable of governing China in a way that benefited the Chinese people. So by that, they didn't do a land reform, for example. If they'd done land reform, then maybe China would not have become communist, like the peasants have had land. Keep in mind, America, the reason why we don't have all these revolutions, right? We're busy chopping down trees. That's why we don't chop off heads. We have so much free land. We don't have peasantry, do we? Well, we have slaves, and that's terrible. But we don't have, like, for our American citizens, free slavery, they can own land. Well, that didn't happen in China. How do you spell Chang? Okay, I'll show you. So actually, I should maybe show you the whole narrative here. I'll give you a Mao versus Chiang Kai-shek picture.
Good afternoon, Mr. President. I do have one brief announcement. This is from our FFA. Congratulations to Caleb Sutton for competing in the Virginia FFA State Tracker Operators Career Development event yesterday at Rockingham County Fairgrounds. Caleb advanced to the state competition, served as the overall South Ridge area representative. He placed third in the written exam and fourth overall. Congratulations, Caleb.
Can you see that?
We hope everybody will have a safe weekend. Thank you.
So these were the two sides of the Chinese Civil War, Mao and Chiang. And Mao was backed by the communists, the Soviets. He was a communist, and he was a really doctrinaire communist, although his behavior was, again, not necessarily Marxist purely. But enormous support from the masses, which, again, if your government doesn't get the masses support, you're probably not going to last long. All right, unless you're a dictator. All right, and they use guerrilla warfare, and they've been doing it for 40 years, and so they win. And this becomes an enormously important issue in America politically because Truman and the Democratic Party are going to be blamed for this. And what that's going to create is a posture amongst Democrats of having to seem tough. And so that means that they may have scenarios where we are more aggressive than we needed to be. All right, or we amplify the problem to seem tough, right? Because the Democrats are seen as pinkos, soft on communism. And then to make things even worse that year, the Soviet Union drops the atom bomb. They test their very first atom bomb in 4 years after we used ours. Now, Truman had expected them to get one eventually. He'd been told it would take them decades. It took them 4 years. And we know that the reason they did this is because they spied on America. Now, they certainly had scientists, and they captured some Germans too, but they were able to kind of get a jump start because they got information from us. So as you can imagine, here you have two of the most devastating moments of the Cold War. Mao taking over, communism taking over in China, and the Soviets have the atom bomb. And so now this is going to create what becomes known in history as the arms race. The arms race. And that is going to lead to a concept that is absolutely horrifying, certainly by 52. And that is mutually assured destruction. Now, the good news about mutually assured destruction, if there is any, is it does create a concept called deterrence. So what deterrence is you don't want to, I won't nuke you because I don't want to be nuked by you in the process. Because of our information, we will know that you have nukes. Now, the first nukes are dropped from airplanes. So this means in the 40s and early 50s, the Cold War takes on a new nuclear mushroom cloud shadow, right? But that still has to be delivered by an airplane. By the late 50s, it's missiles. And so that's going to bring another new factor into the Cold War, right? The idea of shooting missiles. But we're not there yet. So we're going to stop today with the idea of the arms race. Plus, the United States created the first fission bomb, which is using plutonium. And that creates a 10 times, or bigger than 10 times the size of the atom bomb. So what is this? Fusion. Yeah, I said fission. Fusion. That's what I meant. You're right. Hydrogen is fusion. The uranium is fission, splitting the atom. Fusion is trying to put two uranium isotopes in the same spot. And it crushes them together. Yeah, good point. So this is the hydrogen bomb. So definitely be aware of this. So on that note, have a great weekend. All right. And I will see you guys back online Tuesday. Okay. Take care.